Imagine an ancient map, parchment stained with salt and age, spread across a captain's desk somewhere in the Mediterranean. The coastlines are rough, hand-drawn, barely accurate. But scattered across the open water, there are warnings. Tiny illustrations of women rising from the waves. Faces beautiful enough to stop your breath. And underneath each one, the same word scrawled in faded ink. Danger. These maps weren't decorated for fun. They were survival guides. Because for thousands of years, sailors believed that somewhere out in the deep water, between the rocky islands and the fog-choked straits, something was singing. Something that sounded so impossibly beautiful that men would throw themselves overboard just to get closer to it. They called them sirens. And the strangest part? These weren't fairy tales invented to scare children. Experienced captains, hardened naval officers, men who had survived storms and warfare and months without land, they all swore the sirens were real. They mapped their locations. They developed strategies to survive passing through siren territory. They tied themselves to their own ships. So what were the sirens? Where did this legend come from? And why did it persist for over 3,000 years across dozens of cultures, from ancient Greece to the golden age of piracy? To answer that, we need to go back to the very beginning. Back to a time when the sea wasn't just dangerous, it was divine. The birth of a myth. The oldest known references to the sirens come from ancient Greece, somewhere around the 8th century BC. But the myth itself is almost certainly older than that, passed down through oral tradition for generations before anyone thought to write it down. In the earliest versions, the sirens weren't what you probably picture right now. They weren't mermaids. They weren't half-fish women lounging on rocks. The original Greek sirens were depicted as bird women. They had the bodies of large birds with the heads and sometimes the upper torsos of human women. Think of a harpy, but beautiful, disturbingly beautiful. According to Greek mythology, the sirens were originally companions of Persephone, the goddess who was kidnapped by Hades and dragged into the underworld. When Persephone disappeared, her companions searched everywhere for her. Some versions say Demeter, Persephone's mother, cursed them with bird bodies as punishment for failing to protect her daughter. Other versions say the gods gave them wings so they could search for Persephone across land and sea. Either way, the transformation changed them. They settled on a small rocky island somewhere in the Mediterranean, and they began to sing. But their song wasn't just music. It was described as something that bypassed rational thought entirely, something that spoke directly to whatever part of the human mind controls desire, longing, and obsession. The ancient Greeks didn't think the sirens were trying to be evil necessarily. They believed the sirens were compelled to sing, cursed to lure, trapped in an endless cycle where their beauty and their voices became weapons they couldn't put down. But the result was always the same. Ships would pass too close to their island. Sailors would hear the singing, and one by one, they'd lose all sense of self-preservation. Some accounts say the men steered their ships directly into the rocks, destroying the vessel and drowning everyone aboard. Other accounts say individual sailors would simply leap into the water and try to swim toward the sound, only to be pulled under by the currents around the island's rocky shore. The sirens themselves didn't need to attack anyone. The geography did the killing. The singing just provided the motivation. And here's what made the myth so powerful. It wasn't about monsters. It wasn't about creatures jumping out of the water to drag you down. The horror of the sirens was that you became the weapon. Your own desire, your own longing, your own inability to resist, that's what killed you. The sirens just sang. You did the rest. Before we go any further, I need to stop for a second, because what I've been showing you in these videos only scratches the surface. And I realized at some point that the full picture, the actual pirate code, word for word, the real punishment records, the exact treasure division shares, the ports that secretly funded them, it doesn't fit in a video. I put it all into one document, the Black Flag Codex. It's linked below, and the QR code is on your screen. Now, let's keep going. Odysseus and the most famous encounter in history. The most well-known siren story in all of Western literature comes from Homer's Odyssey, written somewhere around 700 BC. And it's famous for a reason, because Odysseus didn't just survive the sirens. he engineered a way to hear their song and live to tell about it. Here's how it went down. After leaving the island of Circe, the sorceress who had turned his men into pigs, Odysseus received a warning. Circe told him that his route home would take him past the island of the Sirens, and she was very specific about what would happen if his crew heard the singing. They would forget everything: their families, their mission, their own survival. They would be consumed by the song, and they would die. Circe's advice was simple: plug your ears with beeswax and sail past as fast as possible. But Odysseus, being Odysseus, wanted more. He wanted to actually hear what the sirens sounded like. He was curious. And that curiosity is what makes the story so interesting, because it reveals something deeply human about the siren myth. Even when you know something will destroy you, part of you wants to experience it anyway. So Odysseus came up with a plan. He ordered his men to plug their ears with beeswax so they couldn't hear anything. Then he had them tie him to the mast of the ship. He told them explicitly that no matter what he said, no matter how much he begged, no matter what he promised or threatened, they were not to untie him until they were well past the island. And that's exactly what happened. As the ship approached the Sirens' Island, Odysseus heard the singing. And according to Homer, it was everything the legends promised and worse. The sirens didn't just sing a beautiful melody. They sang to Odysseus specifically. They called him by name. They told him they knew everything he'd been through: the war at Troy, the years of wandering, the losses he'd suffered. They promised him knowledge. They promised him peace. They promised him the one thing every exhausted, homesick sailor wants more than anything: rest. Odysseus went out of his mind. He screamed at his men to untie him. He strained against the rope so hard they cut into his skin. He promised his crew anything they wanted if they'd just let him go. He threatened to kill them when he got free. His men, deaf from the beeswax, just looked at him thrashing against the mast and kept rowing. Eventually, the ship passed beyond the range of the song, and Odysseus came back to himself. He was shaking, bleeding from the rope burns, and completely shattered by the experience. But he was alive. That story has been retold for almost 3,000 years. And the reason it resonates isn't just because it's a clever survival strategy. It's because it captures a truth about human psychology that people recognized even in 700 BC. We are drawn to the things that destroy us. And the only reliable defense isn't willpower. It's restraint imposed from the outside. Odysseus didn't trust himself. He knew he wouldn't be strong enough. So he built a system that made his weakness irrelevant. That's not mythology. That's human nature described with perfect accuracy 3 millennia ago. The Island of Bones. Homer's account was the most famous, but it wasn't the only one. Other ancient writers added layers to the siren myth that made it even more disturbing. Apollonius of Rhodes, writing several centuries after Homer, described the Sirens' Island in graphic detail. He said the shoreline was covered in the remains of previous victims, not just bones, rotting flesh, skin drying in the sun, the bodies of men who had been lured to the rocks and then simply left there to decompose. The sirens didn't eat their victims. They didn't collect them as trophies. They apparently had no use for the sailors at all once they were dead. The killing wasn't the point. The singing was the point. The luring was the point. The death was just a byproduct that the sirens either didn't notice or didn't care about. That detail makes the myth significantly darker than most monster stories. A dragon hoards treasure. A cyclops eats people. There's a logic to those monsters, a motivation you can understand. But the sirens killed without purpose. Their song was a compulsion, not a strategy. And the bodies that piled up on their shore were just evidence of a curse that nobody, not even the sirens themselves, could break. Apollonius also introduced the idea that the sirens could be defeated, not just survived. In his version of the Argonautica, the hero Jason and his crew of Argonauts also passed the Sirens' Island. But instead of beeswax and ropes, Jason had a secret weapon. Orpheus, the greatest musician in all of Greek mythology, was on board. When the sirens began to sing, Orpheus pulled out his lyre and played. And he played louder, more beautifully, more powerfully than the sirens could sing. He didn't block the sound. He overwhelmed it. He gave the sailors something better to listen to, all except one. A sailor named Butes couldn't resist. He heard the siren song cutting through Orpheus's music and threw himself overboard. He was rescued by the goddess Aphrodite before he drowned, but the message was clear. Even the greatest countermeasure wasn't perfect. The sirens could still reach you if your defenses had even the smallest gap. There's also a lesser-known tradition that says the sirens were fated to die if anyone ever heard their song and survived. After Odysseus passed their island, some ancient writers claim the sirens threw themselves into the sea in despair. The cursed destroyers became the final victims of their own legend. It's a tragic ending that adds another dimension to the myth, the idea that the sirens were prisoners of their own nature, compelled to destroy and then destroyed by their own failure to do so. Why sailors were so vulnerable. To understand why the siren myth had such staying power, you need to understand what life at sea was actually like for ancient sailors. Because the conditions these men endured made them psychologically primed for exactly the kind of hallucination the siren legend describes. First, isolation. Ancient sailors spent weeks, sometimes months, without seeing land. They were crammed onto small wooden ships with the same group of men, eating the same terrible food, breathing the same stale air. The monotony was crushing, and monotony does strange things to the human brain. Modern research on sensory deprivation shows that when the brain isn't receiving enough varied stimulation, it starts generating its own. People in isolation tanks report hearing voices, seeing figures, experiencing elaborate hallucinations that feel completely real. Now imagine that, but instead of a controlled lab environment, you're sleep-deprived on a ship in the middle of the ocean with nothing to look at but water in every direction. Second, dehydration and malnutrition. Ancient sailors rarely had enough fresh water. Their food was often rotten or infested. Scurvy, caused by vitamin C deficiency, was rampant, and one of its symptoms is psychological disturbance, including confusion, irritability, and auditory hallucinations. A crew suffering from scurvy wouldn't just be physically weakened, their minds would be compromised too. Third, the sounds of the sea itself. Wind passing through rock formations along coastlines can produce eerie, almost musical sounds. Narrow straits and cave systems amplify and distort these sounds in ways that can genuinely sound like singing, especially to exhausted, malnourished, desperate sailors who haven't heard a human voice outside their crew in weeks. And fourth, loneliness. Not just physical isolation, but emotional starvation. These men were away from their families, their wives, their communities for months or years at a time. The sirens didn't just promise beautiful music. According to Homer, they promised knowledge, comfort, understanding, connection. They promised the thing sailors wanted most, the thing they were most starved for. So when you combine all of these factors, sensory deprivation, malnutrition, strange oceanic acoustics, and profound emotional loneliness, you get a population that was almost engineered to hear things that weren't there. And not just random noise, meaningful things, beautiful things, things that spoke directly to their deepest needs. The siren myth wasn't just a story. It was a framework that sailors used to explain real psychological experiences they were actually having. They heard singing. They felt compelled toward it. They watched their companions become entranced. And because they had no concept of hallucination or cognitive impairment, they explained it the only way that made sense to them. Something out there was singing, and it wanted them dead. The siren legend goes global. Here's where it gets really interesting. The siren myth didn't stay in Greece. Versions of the same story appeared independently in cultures all over the world, in places that had no contact with Greek civilization. In Norse mythology, there were the Fossagrim, water spirits who played music so beautiful that listeners would be drawn into rivers and lakes and drown. The Scandinavian version added a detail that the Greek version lacked. The Fossagrim could teach you their music, but only if you sacrificed something in return. The price was always steep, often your sanity, sometimes your life. In German folklore, the Lorelei was a maiden who sat on a steep rock above the Rhine River, singing so beautifully that sailors below would crash into the rocks because they were staring up at her instead of watching the water. The Lorelei Rock is a real place, and it sits at one of the most dangerous points on the Rhine, a narrow stretch where the current is treacherous and the rocks are hidden just below the surface. Hundreds of ships have wrecked there over the centuries. The legend of the Singing Woman was how people explained the unusually high number of disasters at that specific location. In Irish and Scottish folklore, the Selkies were seal women who could shed their skin and appear as beautiful humans. While Selkies were generally less malicious than sirens, they still represented the dangerous allure of the sea, and men who fell in love with Selkies were said to be forever haunted by their longing, unable to live fully on land because part of them would always be listening for a voice from the water. In Japanese mythology, there were the Ningyo, fish-like beings whose flesh granted immortality, but whose capture brought storms and disaster. The Ningyo weren't singers, but they represented the same idea. The sea held something irresistible, something that promised everything you wanted, but the cost of pursuing it was catastrophe. West African maritime traditions included stories of Mamiwata, a water spirit of extraordinary beauty who would lure men with promises of wealth and power. Those who accepted her gifts became wealthy, but were forbidden from touching another woman for the rest of their lives. Those who refused lost everything. In Southeast Asian waters, Filipino sailors told stories of the Sirena, a mermaid-like creature whose singing could hypnotize fishermen and drag them beneath the waves. The Sirena legends were particularly strong in areas with dangerous currents and hidden reef systems, exactly the kind of geography where the Greek siren myth also thrived. The pattern is unmistakable. Across oceans, across millennia, across cultures that never exchanged a single word with each other, the same story keeps appearing. Beautiful beings near the water, an irresistible sound or allure, sailors or fishermen who lose their minds trying to reach it, death by drowning, by rocks, by their own inability to look away. This isn't coincidence. This is human beings, everywhere and always, having the same experience of the sea and reaching for the same explanation. Sirens and the Golden Age of Piracy. By the time the Golden Age of Piracy rolled around in the late 1600s and early 1700s, the siren myth had been alive for over 2,000 years. And pirates, for all their reputation as tough, ruthless pragmatists, were among the most superstitious sailors who ever lived. This makes sense when you think about it. Pirates spent more time at sea than almost anyone else. They couldn't dock at friendly ports for supplies and rest the way legitimate sailors could. They were constantly exposed to the same conditions that made ancient Greek sailors vulnerable: isolation, poor nutrition, sleep deprivation, and the relentless psychological pressure of knowing that every ship on the horizon might be the one that kills you. Pirate crews developed elaborate superstitions around every aspect of seafaring life. They believed whistling on deck could summon storms. They believed women aboard ship were bad luck, though the real history is more complicated than that. They believed certain days were cursed for setting sail, and many of them absolutely believed in sirens or siren-like creatures. Blackbeard himself, Edward Teach, was said to have been deeply superstitious about supernatural sea creatures. While there's no verified historical quote about Blackbeard specifically fearing sirens, contemporary accounts describe him deliberately cultivating an image of someone who communicated with dark forces, including whatever lived beneath the waves. He lit slow-burning fuses in his beard during battle to look demonic. He told his crew he'd made deals with the devil. Whether he believed any of it or just used it strategically is impossible to know, but the superstition was real, and it extended to the entire crew. Stop for a second. What you just heard about the pirate code is the part that rewrites everything you thought you knew, but it only lands when you see the actual shares, the exact fractions written into the Articles of Agreement, the punishments, the port records, the names of the men who funded them from government offices. It's all in the Black Flag Codex, linked in the description. 5 seconds. Grab it now, because what comes next builds directly on it. Link is below. QR code is on your screen. Bartholomew Roberts, one of the most successful pirates in history, was known for enforcing strict discipline aboard his ships, including rules about when and where crew members could be on deck at night. While some historians attribute this to practical security concerns, others note that the specific language used in pirate codes sometimes referenced dangers that weren't entirely human. The night watches on pirate ships weren't just looking for enemy sails. They were looking for anything unusual in the water. And it wasn't just individual captains. The pirate code, the set of rules that governed life aboard pirate ships, sometimes included provisions that sound suspiciously like siren defense protocols. Crew members were forbidden from abandoning their posts to follow sounds or lights in the water. Sailors who claimed to hear singing were to be restrained and kept below decks until the ship had moved on. These weren't explicitly labeled as anti-siren measures, but the implication was clear enough. There's also the matter of wreckers, people who lived along rocky coastlines and deliberately lured ships to their destruction by lighting false beacon fires. Wreckers would then scavenge the wreckage for cargo, supplies, and valuables. This practice was widespread in the Caribbean, along the coast of Cornwall in England, and throughout the Mediterranean. Some wreckers took the deception further. There are historical accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries of wreckers using women to sing or call out from the shoreline, creating the impression of a safe harbor or a settlement where there was only rocks and reef. Sailors would steer toward the voices, and their ships would be torn apart. In other words, the siren legend wasn't entirely mythological by the time pirates were sailing the Caribbean. There really were voices coming from the shore. There really were people luring sailors to their deaths with sound and deception. The sirens just happened to be human. And here's the darkest part. Some of these wrecking operations were organized by local governments and wealthy landowners who took a cut of the salvage. The people singing on the rocks weren't supernatural creatures. They were employees. The siren legend had become a business model. The science of irresistible sound. Modern science has spent a surprising amount of time studying why certain sounds affect the human brain the way they do. And some of the findings line up eerily well with what the siren myth describes. The human brain processes music differently from other types of sound. When you hear speech, specific language centers in your brain activate. But when you hear music, especially music with certain harmonic properties, it triggers activity across multiple brain regions simultaneously, including the reward centers that are also activated by food, sex, and addictive substances. Neuroscientists have identified a phenomenon called frisson, the physical chill or emotional wave you sometimes feel when hearing a particularly beautiful piece of music. Frisson is caused by a surge of dopamine, the same neurotransmitter involved in addiction. Your brain is literally giving you a hit of pleasure chemicals in response to sound. Now imagine hearing the most beautiful sound your brain has ever processed, but you're in a state of extreme sensory deprivation. You haven't heard music in months. You're malnourished, dehydrated, possibly feverish. Your brain is starving for stimulation. The dopamine response wouldn't just be pleasant, it would be overwhelming. It could easily override your rational judgment, your survival instincts, your ability to recognize danger. There's also research on infrasound, sound frequencies below the range of human hearing. Infrasound can't be consciously perceived, but it affects the body in measurable ways. Exposure to infrasound can cause feelings of unease, anxiety, disorientation, and in extreme cases, visual disturbances and a sense of presence. The feeling that someone or something is nearby even when nothing is there. Ocean waves, wind through cave systems, and water moving through narrow straits all generate infrasound. Sailors passing through certain geographic formations would have been exposed to infrasound for hours without knowing it, gradually becoming more anxious, more disoriented, more susceptible to interpreting ordinary sounds as something extraordinary. Combine infrasound-induced anxiety with auditory hallucinations from sleep deprivation and malnutrition. Add in the natural acoustic effects of wind on rock, and you have a recipe for exactly the experience the sirens are said to create. A sound that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere. A sense of overwhelming beauty and desire. A compulsion to move toward the source that overrides all rational thought. The sirens might not have been real, but the experience of the sirens absolutely was. The psychology of fatal attraction. There's a concept in psychology called the call of the void. In French, it's called l'appel du vide. It describes the strange, intrusive thought that many people experience in high places, the sudden urge to jump even when you have no desire to die. Standing on a cliff, looking down, and feeling not fear, but a weird, irrational pull toward the edge. Researchers believe this phenomenon is caused by a conflict between two brain systems. Your survival instinct screams danger and pulls you back. But a different part of your brain, the part that processes novelty and curiosity, is fascinated by the drop. For a fraction of a second, curiosity wins. You feel the pull. Then your rational mind catches up and you step back. The siren myth is essentially the call of the void applied to the ocean. Sailors standing at the rail of their ship, staring at the water, hearing something that might be wind or might be singing, and feeling that irrational pull. Not wanting to die, just wanting to get closer to the source. Curiosity overriding caution. The same cognitive glitch that makes people lean too far over balcony railings, but stretched out over hours by the monotony and sensory deprivation of open ocean sailing. And here's the part that makes the myth psychologically accurate in a way that's almost uncomfortable. The sirens didn't force anyone to do anything. They sang. The sailors chose to jump. The destruction was self-inflicted, which is exactly how the call of the void works. Nobody pushes you. The danger comes from inside. This is why the siren myth has resonated for 3,000 years, while other sea monster legends have faded. The kraken is scary, but it's external. A sea serpent is terrifying, but it attacks you. The sirens reveal something about yourself. They show you that somewhere inside your own mind, there's a mechanism that can be hijacked. A vulnerability that can't be armored against because it's part of who you are. Odysseus understood this. That's why he didn't try to resist through willpower. He knew willpower wouldn't be enough. He had himself physically restrained because he recognized that his own mind couldn't be trusted. And that level of self-awareness in a character from a 3,000-year-old poem is remarkable. The geography of doom. Throughout history, specific locations in the Mediterranean were associated with the sirens, and almost all of them share the same geographic features. The Sirenum scopuli, the rocks of the sirens, were traditionally placed near the Italian coast, close to the island of Capri, or along the Amalfi coast near the Ligali Islands. These tiny rocky islets sit in waters with powerful currents, hidden reefs, and unpredictable wind patterns. Ships that got too close to the shore in this area genuinely did wreck at alarming rates. The Strait of Messina between mainland Italy and Sicily was another legendary danger zone. This strait was associated with both the sirens and two other famous monsters, Scylla and Charybdis. The narrow passage creates powerful whirlpools and cross-currents that have sunk ships for millennia. Ancient sailors who survived the passage described hearing sounds from the rocks, sounds that could easily be interpreted as singing by terrified, exhausted men. The Bosphorus Strait near modern-day Istanbul was another hotspot. The narrow channel connecting the Black Sea to the Mediterranean has steep cliffs on both sides that create natural echo chambers. Sounds carry across the water in distorted, amplified ways. Sailors reported hearing voices from the cliffs, conversations, singing, even laughter, when no one was visible on shore. In every case, the siren locations mapped precisely onto areas where the geography was genuinely dangerous and where natural acoustic effects could produce sounds that resembled human voices. The myth didn't create the danger created the myth. Ancient cartographers marked these areas on their maps with illustrations of sirens, sea monsters, or simply the words, "Here be danger." These weren't decorative choices. They were data. The siren illustrations on ancient maps were essentially maritime hazard warnings, encoding real navigational intelligence into a mythological framework that every sailor would understand and take seriously. A captain who might ignore a warning that said dangerous currents would never ignore a warning that said sirens. The myth was more effective than the fact, which might be the most intelligent thing ancient cultures ever did with storytelling. The legacy that never died. The siren myth didn't end with ancient Greece. It didn't end with the golden age of piracy. It's still alive today, woven so deeply into human culture that you probably don't even realize you're interacting with it. The word siren itself has been adopted into everyday language. An emergency siren is called that because it's a sound designed to be impossible to ignore, a sound that overrides whatever you're doing and demands your attention. The naming wasn't accidental. Early warning system designers specifically chose the word because of its mythological association with sounds you can't resist. In psychology, the concept of siren song has become shorthand for any temptation that promises pleasure but delivers destruction. Addiction researchers use it. Behavioral economists use it. It's become the default metaphor for understanding why humans repeatedly choose things they know are bad for them. In literature and film, the siren has never gone away. From the Rhine maidens in Wagner's Ring Cycle to the mermaids in Pirates of the Caribbean, from the Lorelei in German Romantic poetry to the sirens in O Brother, Where Art Thou, the story keeps being retold because it keeps being relevant. Every generation finds new ways to be lured by irresistible things. The medium changes, the mechanism doesn't. And in modern maritime safety, the legacy of the siren is everywhere. Lighthouses were built to counter the wrecker's trick of false beacon fires. Foghorns were developed to help sailors navigate acoustically confusing waters. GPS and modern navigation technology have made it nearly impossible to be lured onto rocks by misleading sounds or lights. Every one of these innovations is, in a sense, a modern solution to the ancient siren problem. But here's the thing that keeps the myth alive. We haven't actually solved the underlying issue. Technology has eliminated the specific danger of being lured onto rocks by singing. But the psychological vulnerability the sirens represent, the human tendency to be drawn toward things we know will hurt us, to follow the beautiful voice even when every rational thought is screaming to turn away, that's still there. It's in the way people stay in relationships they know are destructive. It's in the way entire populations can be captivated by leaders who promise impossible things. It's in the way a gambler walks back into a casino knowing the house always wins. The sirens are a metaphor, and the thing they're a metaphor for hasn't changed in 30 centuries. The ancient Greeks understood something that we're still wrestling with. The most dangerous thing in the world isn't a monster with teeth and claws. It's a voice that tells you exactly what you want to hear. Odysseus survived because he knew he was vulnerable. He didn't pretend he was strong enough to resist. He didn't claim he was special. He looked at the thing that had killed every sailor before him and said, "I am not immune to this. Tie me down." 3,000 years later, that's still the only strategy that works. The ocean is quieter now. The old shipping routes have been charted and mapped to the inch. Nobody believes that bird women sit on rocks in the Mediterranean waiting for wooden ships to pass. But the song hasn't stopped. It never does.